Hi everybody, my name is Julia and my project is going to be centered around something that came to mind for me after our discussion in class the other day about invisible disabilities, and my group specifically was assigned to talk about the stigma surrounding invisible disabilities, what are invisible disabilities, and I learned during that discussion that an estimated 10% of people in the US have a medical condition that is classified as an invisible disability, and someone who I live with has an intellectual disability, and the way that that has functioned and operated in my family and the stigma attached to that was something that came to mind as we had that discussion in class, and I wanted to explore in my project what are the day-to-day effects of stigma, what are the effects on people's health, employment, and their access to opportunities and things like that. So I kind of went on a little research adventure to figure out some of those things and learn more, and I'm going to share a little bit about what I found in that research. Oh, also, my field placement this year works primarily with those who experience disabilities, but we never talked about stigma or any elements of stigma in our training, or were directed to ever address that in a clinical setting with members of our agency, and I just think that's interesting. I don't know if that's the case for other agencies, but I would like to have more discussions about it at least, and currently I feel a little bit incompetent to address that in a clinical setting, so I definitely wanted to learn more there. And some things that have guided my research and provoked my thought-provoking for me was thinking about the medical model of disability and how seeing disability as something that's a problem to be fixed, as well as the religious model of seeing disability as a punishment from God, or again, something that's wrong and needs to be fixed, how those deeply rooted belief systems affect how we see disability in society. And that discussion at the beginning of our course has kind of led into this as well. And the economic model was another one that asserts disability as a hindrance to economic productivity. And that actually came up a lot in my research, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. The first study that I looked at, by Teresa L. Scheid, observed the effects of stigma in relation to obtaining employment after the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed. They basically called different corporations and organizations and interviewed them about their hiring practices after the ADA passed some legislation to provide protection for those with intellectual and mental disabilities. And they classified the different responses into whether or not employers had any hiring practices at all or any policies that protected those with disabilities, and whether they did that in order to avoid a lawsuit, or whether they did that because they thought it was the right thing to do, or they wanted equal access for all people. And it was kind of 50-50, as 50% of people verbally said, like, we want to avoid a lawsuit and that's why we're doing this, and the other 50% of people were more on the fence of this is the right thing to do and we want to provide accessible opportunities for those who are applying. But in the research, as they looked at different articles and statistics, they found that people really were affected by the stigma that exists in society in relation to intellectual disabilities, in particular, that those with intellectual disabilities are not competent in the workforce and not productive. And although there are accommodations that can be provided, a lot of employers actually aren't comfortable or willing to provide those accommodations. I'm definitely losing my place here. One moment. They even quoted one person, the director of the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, Leonard S. Rubenstein, in 1996, described the ADA as carrying a lot of freight for people with psychiatric disabilities, seeking nothing less than to transform a world that is not quite ready for it. So it's interesting thinking about how these belief systems, like specifically the economic model, has affected our hiring practices and how that's related to stigma and provides a lack of opportunity. And just thinking about specifically in relation to employment opportunities, and how important this is as social workers too, because we're going to be working with people who experience disabilities, and it's good to be aware of the stigma attached to hiring folks with disabilities and also advocating on their behalf and alongside them. Another thing the article said that I thought was true and really interesting is that stigma can lead to ambivalence or, at worst, hatred and outright discrimination. It contributes to internalized belief systems among those who have a disability about rejection and community attitudes towards disability. So it creates negative internal self-perception and things like that, which wasn't as much something I thought of. And in the end, they found that researchers overall, in more of a group study, they demonstrated that a history of mental illness will lead to fewer job offers and more negative reactions from employers. They also found that very few companies implemented policies in assisting those with disabilities to apply for jobs, with 50% of those who did doing it to avoid a lawsuit with the EEOC, although the ADA made some positive effects on employment practices. Another study in the Lancet Global Health created a global study that examined government action as reported to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We'll call it CRPD. The CRPD committee, and they gathered data from 667 disability experts and organizations from 88 countries regarding the extent to which low awareness of intellectual disability and stigma are continuing concerns and what is being done to tackle these concerns. So they're looking at a global perspective how stigma and lack of access affects those with intellectual disabilities in particular in different countries. They found that in most places, citizens see inclusion as agreeable and something they're aspiring to, but they don't see it as practical or achievable. And in middle to lower income nations, it's still harder to obtain equal access to basic human rights, and those with disabilities face a higher level of stigma in middle to low income nations. In some former Soviet countries, as well as Africa and Asia, a desire exists to still segregate those with disabilities from society due to beliefs that fit into the religious model, or beliefs that disabled folks are incapable of participating in society at large. Organizations attempting to make change in this are usually non-governmental organizations and independently run. The findings in this study demonstrate that fighting stigma for those with intellectual disabilities is a lower priority for government programming worldwide. We need more policymakers and program leaders who understand the detrimental effects of stigma to rise up and advocate for change in this area. It's also important to note that we are advocates, and many of us will end up working in policy at some level, so it's important to be aware of the effects of stigma. Another study by Song, Malik, and Greenberg in 2018 examined the experience of stigma as a source of chronic stress among parents of individuals with developmental disorders or mental health problems and their health outcomes over time. And this one really affected me in a personal way, as my parents are caring for someone who is not capable of living on their own, living with an intellectual disability. And they found in this study that I thought it was interesting, they particularly looked at stigma as the source of negative health outcomes for parents of those with disabilities, and that's not even looking at the negative health effects of stigma on the actual person who has a disability, but they found that parents reported poorer health outcomes over time and poorer self-perceived health over decades, and as they're spending more energy caring for kids and also experiencing stigma from other parents and maybe judgment from other people in society, it had a negative outcome on their health. So I thought that was really important to address and interesting, as far as like stigma is very far-reaching as it affects the whole family, and more importantly affects those with disabilities in a very real, tangible way. So as social workers, we have a responsibility to be educated about stigma, to advocate against it, and to be a part of creating and utilizing better language in regards to disability. We need to amplify and listen for the voices of folks with disabilities and learn from their experiences. Thank you guys so much for listening, and have a great day.